Hello, my name is Jay Sherry, and as chair of the Kristine Mann Library Board, I want to welcome you to today's presentation. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to tell you a little bit about the library and its award. They are named for Kristine Mann, an English professor at Vassar College, who became one of America's first Jungian psychoanalysts. Her personal library was the nucleus for this now internationally known collection related to analytical psychology. Our mission is to disseminate this knowledge to a broad public constituency and to assist scholarship in our field. To that end, an annual award was instituted, whose first recipient, Hilda, explored the relevance of the Gnostic Sophia for our time. Her presentation was held at the Jung Center of New York in 2019. But then the pandemic arrived and the great interruption was underway. That was 3 long, pain-filled years ago. So it is now with a feeling of renewal that I introduce today's speaker, who helps inaugurate the restart of our public program. Our speaker, Robert TYMINSKI, will speak for about 1 hour, exploring the theme of immigrating to a new place from a depth psychological perspective. After he finishes, there will be a 5-minute break, after which Carol Cooper, our board member, will moderate the Q&A session. Robert's theme of immigration is one of deep personal concern, since he is the grandson of immigrants and is now married to one. He came of age in upstate New York and graduated from Haverford College. He is on the faculty of the Jung Institute of San Francisco and its past president. He is the author of numerous publications, the most recent of which is his book, The Psychological Effects of Immigrating, which has just been published by Routledge. Please join me in welcoming Robert.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Jay. I have to say thank you to all of you for bearing with us, and you know, this is just part of the world now, I think, that we live in, where you know, if we were 12 or 14 years old, we would have figured this out right away, and it just seems like you know, it's part of, you know, our adaptation both to the pandemic and then to all the technology. So I also want to thank Michael for, you know, troubleshooting for us and sending out the correct link so that more of you can join. I want to thank the Kristine Mann Library for the award, and especially Jay Sherry and the awards committee. This award, I think, is actually, you know, very significant. It makes a contribution in a public way to research into analytical psychology and its connection with the collective. So with very important themes that aren't purely about what happens in a consulting room or an analyst's office. And those connections, I think, are part of what Jung himself might have wanted us to be working on, especially given the troubles of our time. So again, my gratitude to the library, to the awards committee, and to Jay for letting me have this opportunity. I'm going to talk a little bit about the myth that I use to sort of explicate some of the immigrant experience is from the Aeneid, and many of you might know it. And so I'll do a bit of a summary of that. I'm going to show some slides of some artwork that other artists have used the Aeneid as a jumping off point for. And really the art and both my use of the myth is to say something about, there are archetypal aspects to immigrating, and these show up in a variety of images and poetry, music, literature, and they're unique. Each contribution is unique, but there often is overlap. And so what I want to say is that the Aeneid is really just one of many stories of migration, and it's an old one. And so I'm going to hopefully take you through it a bit. I should say that summarizing the Aeneid is probably better left to a high school teacher or a college professor, and so I'm going to try and take us through it in a way that hopefully won't create more confusion. There's a lot in the Aeneid that really characterizes what happens when people undertake a migration. Often they're seeking refuge, and in the process of seeking refuge, they get led far off course. And when they reorient themselves to the path that they want to be on, they often have to fight to stay on that path, and they have to fight to remain where they want to resettle. And these are all pieces and strands that happen in the Aeneid. Many migrants nowadays, and going back centuries, travel vast stretches of land before dangerously crossing some body of water. And so if we look at the pictures and stories today of the migrants from Africa and the Middle East who are crossing the Mediterranean to reach Europe, their journey is really just in many ways, a continuation of something that's been happening for over a couple of thousands of years. So there are lots of translations of the Aeneid, and I'll just mention that the one I'm going to use and that I use in my book is the one by John Dryden, who was an English poet and writing in the 17th century. There are other versions. So his version is a verse version. There are other versions. If you want to read one in prose, William Jackson Knight wrote a prose translation that many readers find just easier to read. So Virgil wrote the Aeneid, and he lived from 70 BCE until 19 AD. And when he finished the Aeneid, many scholars now looking back at it think of it as an unfinished work. It has a somewhat abrupt ending. He wrote it, or began to write it, in the decade after Octavian Augustus defeated Cleopatra, which happened in 30 BCE. It's written in Latin, and it focuses a lot on prized classical definitions of heroic conduct, and those include self-control, avoiding excess, and being loyal, brave, and pious. He's often referred to as pious Aeneas. So why did Virgil write this? That's a question that, it isn't just that a muse came to him. It's actually one of the earliest uses of an archetype or archetypal material for political reasons. So Virgil's intent when he wrote the Aeneid was to create a long story that would connect the founding of Rome with Troy. Troy from, of course, the Iliad. And so he was trying to establish this kind of mythical and in some ways political link with classical Greek times. Aeneas was a member of the royal house of Troy. So it's really, he's the central character. He was the son of Anchises and Venus. Venus, of course, being a goddess, and in the Greek pantheon, that's Aphrodite. After Troy was sacked, he and a band of survivors fled, and he was their leader. At the time it was written, the idea was that Virgil was drawing a comparison between Aeneas and Octavian, and trying to kind of, as a active PR in a way, show how heroic Octavian had been, or was. Octavian ruled Rome in one way or another from 43 BCE until he died in 14 AD. The Aeneid has 12 books, and the first 6 deal with the Trojans' journeys after the fall of Troy, which is thought to have occurred in the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE. The second 6 books describe the war between the Trojans and the native Italian tribes. And they are called Rutulians, and they're led by a prince named Turnus. So in the course of this, of course, there's going to be a lot of gods. And the gods, we have to think of symbolically as being something like random events of fate that interfere with human endeavors. And so the gods in the story are personified, of course, because that was their role. And Juno, or Hera in the Greek, was the goddess most opposing the Trojans. She was against both Troy and their resettling, the Trojans resettling in Italy. And the reason is that some of you may remember from the Iliad that she lost the judgment of Paris. Paris was a Trojan prince who was given a golden apple and asked to decide which of the 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, was the most beautiful. And so he picked Aphrodite, and so Hera, or Juno, had quite a grudge against him, and since he was a Trojan, she nursed that grudge, and that's a big part of the story, is that she acts as an opposing force throughout the Aeneid. The fleet of ships, so they leave by ship. The Trojans sail from Troy. They get waylaid many times, and at one point end up in Africa, where Aeneas meets Dido, who was the queen of Carthage. But that's also a bit of a literary device, because then he can tell her the story of really the first 6 books. So he tells the story of how he escaped with his father Anchises and his son Ascanius, but his wife died during their departure. It's not really clear how she died. Dido listens. She's very sympathetic. She gives the Trojans refuge. And just one quote from the Dryden that gives a sense of her understanding, of Dido's understanding. She says, quote, "Like you, an alien in a land unknown, I learned to pity woes so like my own." And the reason she says that to Aeneas is because she's a refugee as well. She fled Tyre in the Middle East and had to resettle and became the ruler of Carthage. So as I said, a lot of these early books are about the adventures where they get detoured. And I think, if we think about these detours, they really help us to understand something about immigration or migration as being a very difficult undertaking with a lot of hardship and a lot of obstacles. And often immigrant stories contain sections about like being detoured and having to really reorient to try and find the path back. So there's a bit of a love story that happens in Carthage. Of course, that, a good epic wouldn't really be an epic without some spice. And so Aeneas and Dido fall in love. There's some, again, sneaky intervention by the gods that help bringing this about, including an arrow by Cupid. And so it looks like that potentially they might not make it. Now, there's something about making it. Why are they going to Western Italy? Why is that their goal? Well, there's something early on that happens in one of the early books where Aeneas has a dream, and in the dream, the god of the Tiber, which of course is the river in Western Italy, central Western Italy that flows through Rome, tells him that he's supposed to settle in Rome. So the power of this dream is what's motivating Aeneas to make it to Western Italy. But it looks like he's going to be waylaid in Carthage, and so Jupiter or Zeus has to intervene and tell him, no, you need to move on. And at this point in the story, they've been traveling for 7 years. So the reason I'm mentioning that is, again, immigration is not point A to B. It isn't linear, and it isn't something that happens on any kind of a timeline. And so this sense of getting lost and, often having to reconsider a plan is very, very common in immigrant experiences. So Aeneas has a vision. So he does leave, and of course, in good tragic form, after he leaves, poor Dido commits suicide, kills herself because she's so despondent that her hero has abandoned her. He takes his fleet, and they end up in Sicily. So again, they're kind of not on course. They end up somewhere else. And he has a vision there of his father, Anchises, who has died during the journey. And this often also is a part of an immigrant undertaking or journey where the generation that we might think of as the preceding generation either dies or dies soon after landing in the new place. And so the loss of his father, I think, is again part of something that you hear a lot of, as is the loss of his wife. I know there are many stories, especially of the people, who are going in those tiny boats across the Mediterranean, who lost family members, and just the tragedy and pain of that. So he has a vision in Sicily of his father, who says, you need to make a journey to the underworld. Now that again is a bit of a literary device, but it's also symbolically very important because it refers to something about like being in the darkness and being surrounded by dangers, risks, and things that you can't see. And so how do you keep your hope going with that kind of environment? And this is something that, again, many immigrants describe in their stories, that they often feel like they may not use the word underworld, although I have had people in my practice use that term talking about their immigration, but they'll talk about a dark time, or they'll talk about a time when they felt completely disoriented, or they didn't know how things were going to go. Well, that's again kind of typical of what we think of as happening in the underworld from a symbolic standpoint. So the second half of the Aeneid chronicles a war. And so Aeneas lands, they finally reach their destination. It's called Latium. It's basically a region in central Western Italy that includes Rome nowadays. And they land there and they're welcomed at first, but there's a bit of a, friction with some of the locals who aren't sure that they want to accept the migrants. And in particular, tensions really escalate when Ascanius, who is Aeneas's son, inadvertently kills a sacred stag that belonged to the daughter of one of the local kings. And that actually sets off a war. And so again, you have this cycle that seems to be, repeated so many times, both in the Aeneid of it looks like they're there and then they're not. This kind of hope and disappointment, this back and forth between expectations and then collapse, that I think is quite common to immigrant stories. Especially when they speak about their resettlement, and later on I'll talk some about that with the study that I did, where I explored some imagery that immigrants shared with me. So I'm gonna skip a little bit just in sense of the time, but another piece that I do want to say that's important in the Aeneid, and we think of that like immigrants struggle with, is something about carrying their traditions with them. And symbolically in the Aeneid, that is when Anchises, who is Aeneas's father, is initially part of the group. And so is his son. And so you've got three generations moving together. And there's something about cultural transmission that is very important, but also very delicate in this process. And that too is something, that when immigrants finally do resettle, they face different kind of choices about what of their heritage culture are they going to keep alive, what customs and traditions and language norms are they going to follow. So and of course what happens during the entire story of the Aeneid is that Aeneas's son Ascanius was initially about 4 or 5 when they left Troy. So by the time they reached Latium, he's probably about 12 or 13. Now, nowadays, we'd think about that as an early adolescent, but you have to remember, when this was written 2,000 years ago, the lifespan was much shorter. And people often thought of manhood or womanhood coming like around age 15, so it was a really different sense of maturity. So by the time they reach Latium, he's thought of as a juvenile in the Latin word, and so, but that is someone who's in the process of becoming an adult. And as I said, part of what happens then is that this war breaks out. And Turnus, who I mentioned before, is the king of one of these tribes, and the tribe, they're called the Rutulians. And he really feels justified in defending his territory. He thinks the immigrants, the Trojans, are invaders, and he really just kind of decides that he's going to rally as many local kings and princes as he can to his cause, which is to really repel the Trojans and defeat them. So again, think about this. It's something about the new coming in, and then initially there's a bit of a welcome, but then it's like, no, we don't want you around, get out of here. Well, that's again a thousands of year old story that we see today, and I think still, like in some of our heated political dialogue about immigration, shows up. So of course this war goes on, and it has to because epics need some resolution and they need fate to intervene often to create that resolution. Jupiter convenes a council of all the gods. And so at this council, Juno, who I told you before has been very negative about the Trojans and about their settling in Italy, says that she's not going to give in, and she doesn't think they should be allowed to settle because they will occupy the land. That doesn't belong to them. They will steal from the native inhabitants, and they will conquer and rape the natives. So I imagine some of those ideas sound familiar. She's kind of expressing an archetypal xenophobia. And so this xenophobia is something that many, many immigrants, and probably most, have to confront and deal with as part of their experience of resettling. So Jupiter listens to her and he says, okay, well, here's the compromise. And he proposes a compromise that Juno accepts. So she'll give up her opposition and allow the Trojans to settle in this territory of Latium, provided that they speak the native language and adopt the local customs. So in other words, they must assimilate to Latin society. Now, this is kind of an ancient version of the melting pot, and this is a part of the American mythology of immigration as well. And the difficulty I find with this is that there's an implicit demand that newcomers give up most of their traditions and blend in with the receiving land. And so I think there's a kind of almost cultural violence in this attitude. And so nowadays we might think of assimilation as being really like just a reverse colonization, and that is not something that really speaks to the diversity of psyche, but also the diversity of lived life experiences that immigrants have. The sentiment of the melting pot, again, is eerily true to our contemporary ears when we hear political leaders, for example, say that they're not anti-immigrant as long as they learn our language and follow our beliefs. And so again, these ideas are really quite old. And when we run into these old ideas, that's when we start to think about what's the archetypal piece here. So the Aeneid ends in book 12 when basically they've gotten to a stalemate in the war, and so Aeneas and Turnus are going to fight single combat to decide the result. And Turnus gets wounded. He's on his knees and he begs for his life, pleading for mercy. But Aeneas is inclined to not to spare him in this moment, but he sees that that Turnus is wearing a war trophy, and this war trophy happens to be a sword belt that from a young boy that he killed, who was Ascanius's age and was kind of a friend to Ascanius. And so when Aeneas sees that Turnus is wearing this and that Turnus was the one who killed this boy, he becomes enraged and he kills Turnus. In the book, that's it. The Aeneid ends with him driving a sword through Turnus. And so again, the idea there is like, and at the ending, there's something unsettling about that he lost self-control. He acted in rage. And so there's this kind of question mark at the end about like his heroism that scholars debate, classic scholars continue to debate. There was an idea that there should have been a 13th book that really would have wrapped things up, and that just never happened because Virgil died. And so it just so happens that in the 15th century, there was an Italian poet, Maffeo Veggio, and he wrote in Latin. And so he fantasized and imagined a 13th book of the Aeneid and wrote it, which, really portrays Aeneas marrying one of the local princesses, and they have a child. And then that child goes on to be basically a ancestor to the Julian dynasty of Rome. So there, the foundation myth kind of goes full circle. There's just an aside, I think, in the interest of our time, because we had a bit of a glitch at the beginning. I'm going to skip it, but if anybody's interested, there again is some, like, Virgil was very crafty in the way that he wrote the Aeneid and incorporating allusions to current political and military events that were happening within the Roman realm. And one of those had to do with the defeat of Cleopatra. And so he implicitly in the Aeneid is making some kind of a comparison between Cleopatra and Dido. And he's trying to say something about, like, these foreign women, you really need to be careful of them because look at what they do to the heroes. And so, of course, Aeneas did not succumb to Dido and left, but Mark Antony and Cleopatra both died. And so that would be the contemporary for Virgil event that he was referencing. So I think, just again, the Aeneid is really a story, I think, about a difficult migration and building a new home after resettlement. There are many people have commented on some of this, historians. One art historian, Elizabeth Lieshout Nelson, writes, the Aeneas presents to us an archetypal story of a refugee. And a lot of the imagery of the Aeneid has continued to be used and in very subtle ways. And I think I'm going to start the slideshow now. Okay, optimize video clip. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm not going to go over the story again, but I'm just going to show you some of the ways in which okay, so this is a picture of Aeneas is in the center and with the helmet, and he's carrying his father Anchises. His wife Creusa is to the right in this drawing, which is a late Renaissance drawing by Carracci, and then his son Ascanius is down below. And so this is and in the back you can see the fire and the Greek army is pillaging and killing people. You see soldiers and dead bodies, soldiers wielding spears and swords in the background. So this is really the destruction of Troy and this family then trying to gather up and flee. And if you think about this image, again, it's certainly an image from the Aeneid, but I think it has this archetypal dimension of, people don't flee for any reason. They flee to save themselves. They flee because they have to. They flee because they're driven by things like persecution, war, violence, massive climate change that makes their homes uninhabitable. So that was just a picture I can quickly say, let's see if I can get it to go back now, of Laocoon was the priest of Troy, a high priest, and this is a statue in the Vatican. Many of you might have seen it if you've been in the Vatican Museum. It's in an alcove in an atrium, and it's really striking statue. And many Renaissance artists looked at this statue because they thought it would give them an inspiration to connect with classical culture. And in this statue, there's a snake. It's a sea serpent that's come to kill Laocoon and his two sons. The reason being that Laocoon is about to warn the Trojans that the wooden horse they've just let into the city is a trick. And so, of course, that would make the Iliad end very quickly. And so they have to do something to get rid of him. This is the dream I told you about when Tiber appears in Aeneas's dream and says, you're to settle in Italy. And so this dream kind of takes on extreme significance as part of what motivates the Aeneas to move and to want to settle. And this is a painting also by the same artist, Salvador Rosa, of Tiber and Aeneas. This is a famous statue at the Borghese Gallery in Rome. And again, it's this idea of the cultural transmission that I was talking to you about, but also the three generations, the generations moving together. So this is a Bernini statue, and you have Aeneas carrying Anchises, and then down below you can again see Ascanius kind of clutching his leg. This is Carthage, and this is Dido's city. So this is a Turner painting, and it's just to show that this kind of idyllic place in northern Africa that she and her group recreated. The building Carthage is also refugees from Tyre. This is a part of where Aeneas is going to find the entrance to the underworld. This is also by Turner. So he was instructed to look for a golden bow in a tree, or bough in a tree. And so this is the entrance to the underworld. And then there's, I think I mentioned and when they're in Sicily, part of what happens there is a lot of the people get fed up. It's been 7 years and they don't want to keep moving. They think Sicily is plenty good enough. And so the women are kind of, again, there's some divine intervention here that gets them going, and they decide to set fire to the fleet. Somehow Aeneas gets word and he manages to come, and they put out the fire. But then he decides to say to them, in a kind of council where they all meet together, if you want to stay in Sicily, that's fine. And again, this is another archetypal piece of when is a place good enough, and when have you already spent enough time trying to find a better place? So these kind of decisions and choices that immigrants are sometimes forced to make are really quite compelling. And this is part of, so the women stay behind, some of the elderly stay behind, and decide to make their lot in Sicily. This is Ascanius. So when I shooting the stag. So when they arrive in Western Italy, he shoots his stag, and that leads to all kinds of trouble because it's considered a sacred animal. And that here's a Rubens of the same thing. And so you can see the dead stag kind of center, just right of center, and Ascanius is the youth you can see he's actually is a young man now. So think of the boy clutching the dad the dad's leg in the Bernini, and this is now Ascanius 7-8 years later. So he really is almost a young man, but he's committed this horrible act of killing this stag. So this is just a shot of from the early 20th century in the U.S. Peak immigration. I think this is a fascinating fact. The year for peak immigration in terms of total numbers to the United States was 1907. So that's really quite remarkable. And you know, you think about like a lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment nowadays, the numbers are really quite different, much lower than they were at that point over 100 years ago. I put this in here because this is a bit of my experience. I lived 2 blocks from the Berlin Wall for almost 2 years. And so I have my own kind of experience of living in a different country. In addition to being the grandson of immigrants, I spent some time in Germany and kind of got my own view of what it's like to feel you know, leaving the American sector, so to speak. This is a picture, and I just put this in here for a little personal anecdote. This is the area that my grandparents immigrated from. This is, back then there was no country of Poland. This would have been the frontier between the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires. And this is actually, there's a tiny village not far from here where they lived. This is an image that, of course, we're quite familiar with because of what happened during the prior administration with the deplorable conditions at the border of people being put in these really inhumane circumstances who were trying to enter. This is the book. So you know, if any of you have questions in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk more about the book. And there's a lot more clinical material in the book. And so I'm really just giving you a sense here of, you know, some of the pieces of the Aeneid, which is only one chapter in the book. So, so I think, let me see if I can stop the share, and I'm going to go back to this, but I just want to summarize. How are we doing on the time? Okay, so just some of the themes in the Aeneid that I'd like you to keep in mind as we move on to the next part, which is going to be talking about the study that I did of immigrant imagery. So these are some of the things that leap out to me. And again, this is not an you know, exhaustive list, but heroism, the idea of going through heroic ordeals. A patient once told me how tiring it had been for her to wait for her visa to be approved to come study in the United States. And she spent that time working and saving as much money as she could. She said, most of the time, I was just tired to my bones. So that idea of an ordeal and having to persist. Another theme is the notion of coping with differences and how often it happens in the story of the Aeneid, but also in immigrant stories, that at first they're welcomed, but then they're rebuffed and rejected. This kind of dynamism that shifts and that can be really disorienting and jarring. Tribalism is another thing that comes up repeatedly in the Aeneid. And we can think of tribalism as a bit of an archetypal social safety net for the psyche. So it's a way to retreat psychologically, but so internally as well as externally, to something that can feel familiar and safe, but really closes us off. I mean, that's the risk of tribalism, is that it makes us impermeable. Intergroup conflict is a big factor in the Aeneid, and that often derives from some of the tribalism that I just mentioned. refugees know about intergroup conflict in their homelands, because often for them, migration is a way to find a safer place. A patient of mine who came to the US from a dictatorship once told me, quote, "Americans have no clue about what it's like to live in fear of the government. When I hear people protest here about the government interfering in their lives, I think, you got to be kidding me. You want to know what that's really like?" And he went on to describe to me how in the apartment building where he lived, there was a couple, a family that lived floor below that were social activists. And one day when he was a teenager, he was going up the stairs and the door to the apartment was open and it was empty. And their names were gone from the mailbox and everything. And he went up and asked his mother what happened. And she said, "Don't bother asking. They came and took them away." So again, refugees know about intergroup conflict from in a very, very dangerous way. And then the last thing I think I want to say is about the underworld, and then I'll switch back to the study. I think the underworld is an important element, and we can again think of it as a place of darkness. And part of what is so difficult, I think, about being in that place is, how do you make it through? How do you get to a place? How do you keep your hope going so that you make it through to a place where there's more light? I'll just mention one kind of example of this. So a young man whose family had immigrated to the US from Southeast Asia said to me during a session, quote, "My parents never expected there'd be so much crime where they had their store." He meant in the US. This was in a city in California. "The first time they got robbed, they were just in shock for months." And so he went on to tell me that they were ashamed that they had been robbed because they thought that they did something wrong and they brought it on themselves. And they didn't even report it the first time to the police. And so it's this kind of darkness and disorientation that I think, even persists. The underworld isn't just part of what happened in the homeland or during migration. It persists into the resettlement experience as well. The one thing I will say is that the underworld is also a place of hope. And so that is important for us to keep in mind too. So we're going to go back to okay. Everybody see that? So this is a copy of the questionnaire. So I decided that I wanted, as part of the book, and again the grant and the award from the library helped me with this, to distribute a questionnaire and to gather information from current immigrants about what some of their experience had been immigrating. And so this is only page 1. There's a second page, but my limited PowerPoint capacities prevented me from putting up the second page. But it's much more a qualitative questionnaire than anything quantitative. It's really to gather information about subjective impressions. And so I distributed it through social media and different affinity organizations like colleges and career-based groups. Participants signed a consent form. There were there were about 41 respondents. Some of them didn't complete both pages, so I only included 37 respondents. The mean age at immigration was 22 years, and their current mean age was 52. So that meant that they had lived most of their lives in their current country that they had immigrated to. They came from all over the world, and most of them in this sample came to the United States. There were a few who went to Canada and Denmark. They went back to visit their home countries quite frequently, and so that meant that they were preserving a tie to their homeland. They weren't severing that, and they kept their cultural traditions very much alive. So, so this is the imagery. So I asked them to just describe lasting images that were associated with their new country, the country they had immigrated to. And so just to say that features of landscape was the most common response. And that included things like skyscrapers, street scenes, bridges, paths, emptiness, and dimensions of size. Transport referred to things like that we would think of: highways, roads, buses, and other vehicles. And economic life referred to observations about poverty, wealth, and inequality. There were 65 total images reported for the new country. And so, so I'm going to go back now. So this is of the receiving country. This is of their home country, or the country that they left. And the main images reported, again, was landscape, but then people also showed up as the second most common category. And the thing that there were fewer images reported, only 38 overall, which is about not quite, it's a little more than half of that of the new country. So that also is just interesting. I don't know quite what to make of that, but it might say something about what feels more alive in the psyche. The category of landscape, again, is similar to the prior slide that I talked about, but the category of people referred to more specific people like family members or ancestors. And this was different, you know, from the images of people that were reported in the new country. And then I asked them what was difficult about their adjustment. And so this is a question about fitting in and what will it take for me to adapt here. And this question, you know, really reflected, and the responses that people put down were vivid, clear, and specific, that they would describe acculturation as not easy and not smooth. And the interesting thing here is that opportunity shows up as the major kind of challenge to acculturating to the, let's say, primarily to the United States. And the reason is that it felt like a test. It felt like there were so many things here that people could choose to do that there was almost like a sense of performance anxiety. Will they make the right choice for themselves? One person said, the education I got made me prove myself and work hard. Someone else said it was an opportunity to explore and reinvent myself. Alienation and polarization were described often with statements about racism, feeling like an outsider and not truly fitting in. One person said, the image is of a person on an island. Othering included observations about being excluded and treating differently, and the only reason that the person could think of was because they were an immigrant. The sample was very highly educated, and so they're not representative immigrants as a whole who come to the U.S. So I'm going to say a little bit in summary. I'm going to head up toward the end here. I think, you know, I've been trying to talk with you all about like what some of the archetypal characteristics of immigration might be. And I should probably say something about what Jung thought an archetype was. So Jung thought it was something that belonged almost to nature. He wrote, "It is a great mistake in practice to treat an archetype as if it were a mere name, word, or concept. It is far more than that. It is a piece of life, an image connected with the living individual by the bridge of emotion. The archetype is living matter." And so we could really spend like the whole time talking about what he meant by that. But I think what part of my understanding would be that archetypes are something that feel alive in our minds. There's something that draws us to them. And then we look in the world for something that we can relate to that connects. And often we know that we're connecting by a feeling experience, by an emotional response. So I think this is part of how I looked at the images that were reported in the survey I did. And I want you to keep in mind that emotion is a central role in giving an archetype meaning, that without emotion, it would be just something that was kind of very shallow and not very alive. So just in summary about some of these images that I showed you, the images of the new and receiving, I will go back to those just so that it's clear what I'm talking about, of the new country appear centered on perceptions of the landscape for its excitement and size. To some, it seemed too large. Someone wrote, everything is so much bigger in the US. Another added, everything is supersized here. This country is vast. Someone wrote, wow, these big box stores like Walmart and Costco, I got lost the first time I went in. So symbolically, gigantic sizes often bring to mind great effort required to master a task. They can remind us also of being a child, smaller in stature and with less power, who has a lot to learn before growing up. It is as if this emphasis on these large physical dimensions communicated just how much immigrants have to absorb to orient themselves to a new task of a new life in the US. The idea of not belonging occurred many times. Will an immigrant find connection or will they get lost? For example, someone said, there's a strong sense of emptiness. There were also many feelings of disappointment with American society. There were lots of images of city streets, but they were often ambiguous because life looked like it was flowing somewhere, but there was also potential for dead ends. This duality about moving in a direction and then getting lost, I think, is one of the great tasks of immigrating, and it is a recurring motif in the Aeneid. An immigrant might just wonder over an extended period of time if the journey has been worth it. So let's go on because I don't want to. There's so much that I could continue talking about, but I want to leave a lot of time for the Q&A. So I'm going to go to the home country images. So these coalesced in two ways. So the landscapes were often portrayed as a place where the immigrant felt at home. It was as if the natural geography of their home country evoked a cultural wrapping, like a familiar blanket or treasured blanket. And these images were often vivid with vibrant colors, more so than were reported for the images of the landscape images of the receiving country. These feelings, I think, are powerful because that kind of wrapping is associated with belonging to a group in a physical way and knowing a place in such fine detail that it's really kind of second nature. The images about the people were really about their development within their families. One respondent wrote, I see my parents' crying faces at the airport when I flew back. So this idea of ancestors is a real key part of the psychological experience of immigration. How do you keep historical continuity that goes into a past with all the stories that have been passed on to you? So I would say if the landscapes are something like a cultural wrapping, then the images of the people are really something like a familial wrapping. We'll look at the acculturative challenges. These were notable for showing that there are a lot of choices and a lot of obstacles. A feeling that was commented on often was confusion. And confusion often happens to us when there's a disjuncture between our expectations and reality. And if there's too much confusion, that can lead to alienation. So, for example, it could appear that having choices implies you can move forward toward almost anything you want, but then you realize that there are other social factors that stop you, such as othering, racism, biases. Several of the people on this survey noted that they had experiences of being looked down upon because of their accents. So I'm going to move ahead to the close because of the time. But I will say that people in this survey also really emphasized that immigration is difficult. One wrote, "It's not easy to cope with. You leave behind your life history. You open a new page. It's like going to kindergarten." And another wrote, "You don't really feel adapted in either place. You don't feel you belong here or there." And so these images of kindergarten and limbo, those are about something that's very trying emotionally, and it's hard to bridge. Okay, so here's some of the things as I summarize that you can kind of keep your eye on here about what have we been talking about with some of these archetypal aspects. So the survey, I think, did show archetypal trends appearing in the imagery within this sample. And I think these particular ones that showed up that I want to highlight were relocating as a task that seems psychologically gigantic, looking for a foothold in a foreign place that's both appealing and intimidating, having great uncertainty about how a journey will eventually unfold, wishing to take advantage of choices not previously imaginable, resolving feelings of belonging and not belonging, mourning losses of things that are known all too well and that seem to wrap you in familiarity and comfort. So these lived experiences and memories find their emotional expression in the many vibrant images that respondents reported on the survey. And I'm very grateful for them, to their participation, and want to acknowledge their contributions to my research. So I think I am at the end.
This is Carol Cooper. I want to thank you, Robert. I really, really enjoyed your presentation. I'm sure everyone else did as well. What we're going to do now is that we're going to give everybody 4 or 5 minutes to kind of digest and prepare your questions. I'm going to ask all of you to be on the honor system and unmute yourselves, because Robert would like as organic and natural a conversation and Q&A as possible. And let's see, we're looking at 1:30 on the dot right now. Let's say that we will give you guys until 1:35, 1:34 to prepare your questions. Please raise your hands in the time-honored Zoom icon fashion if you have a question, not because I anticipate calling on you, but because if we have a sense of how many people have questions, it gives us an idea of what our time is going to be like. So do that, and you can relax for a minute. And if Robert wants to add any comments during the pause for the question and answer, he can do so now.
Okay. Well, thank you, Carol. I appreciate it. And yeah, I guess the one thing I would say is, so like, you know, this talk really was much more focused on the archetypal aspects of the imagery. And so I hope that came across not only through the Aeneid, but through the art that I showed you and some of the images of the photos. And then certainly the study was really about like how do we integrate our experiences internally and what comes to life for us in terms of images. So that's only a part of my book, but it is certainly a part that is important. I would say an equally and probably more important part of my book are the clinical samples that I have because of the, fairly high percentage of either immigrants themselves or immigrant families that I've worked with in my almost 38 years of practice now, which is sounding like a really big number. So if any of you are interested, I'm happy to share more about the book. So.
Okay, questions and answers are now open. Anyone who wishes to start may start now.
I think Rick has his hand up.
Thank you very much. I also am looking forward to your book. I ordered it and I'm looking forward to reading it. But in the meantime, two concepts that I have had a difficult time understanding, not understanding, but differentiating and staying clear about is assimilation versus acculturation. So you really did clarify what assimilation is, and that is a culture asking the immigrant to kind of become them, become us, develop our language, live with our customs and so on and so forth. I understand acculturation as retaining your autonomy, your cultural differences, home altars, group affiliations, attire, like saris and stuff like that. So where does fitting in, which category would fitting in be? And can you say anything about acculturation vis-a-vis assimilation?
Okay. Yeah. So that's a really good question. I mean, so there's a lot of research on acculturation and a lot of more recent research, I should say. So one of the interesting things I learned and trying to educate myself and learn more about what are psychologists and sociologists and different people think about immigration. There really isn't a lot in, relatively speaking, in the psychological literature until the last 20 years. And that's often something that's commented upon. And so there's often this sense of, that either we missed the boat or we were kind of not very interested in the topic. And so a lot of it is fairly recent research, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So acculturation, there is a model, and I was just trying to look up exactly when the date is that John Barry did his study. That's fairly very. So it's from 2001. So that was one of the first studies where he broke down a model which has continued to be referenced for understanding acculturation. And so in this, there are four categories. It's a 2x2 grid, and it has to do with the degree. So on one, the top two boxes would be the degree of maintaining your heritage culture, either strongly or not at all. And then on the side would be two kind of rows for the degree to which you are basically engaging with the local population or the population of the receiving country, either a lot or not so much. Okay, so there are then these four boxes that result from that. And so where you have people who are having a lot of interaction with the local population and also maintaining their cultural traditions, that's referred to as integration. And that's a situation of biculturality, in which immigrants socialize with the receiving culture, but they don't abandon their heritage culture. Okay, so that's one of the kind of acculturation strategies that is often described. Then if you have moving down, if you have in the column, if you don't interact much with the local population, and but you do maintain your heritage culture, that often results in a kind of separation. And this is often seen, I mean, it's quite common in many immigrant communities. I mean, actually, I can even say I know it from my family, where they don't learn the local language, and they attend churches that are specific to, you know, their religious beliefs in the original country. And so there isn't really an intermingling with the local culture, but there is a dedication to maintaining contact with the original culture. And that often is motivated by some fantasy of reunion, that at some point in time they will reunite with the culture of the original country. So moving on, then you could have, so we're back up in the top row now, where you have very high social participation. So in other words, a lot of interaction with the local culture, but you abandon your heritage culture. That is what Barry defines as assimilation. So assimilation is thought to be, in this context, an acculturative strategy, but a particular one that really means that you, have a lot of interaction with the local culture, but you abandon your heritage culture. So that's what I think is a little bit tricky, and that certainly was what we found at the conclusion of the Aeneid, when they came up with their great compromise, that they would basically learn the language and follow the customs and traditions of the Latin local culture, and not really, continue with their Greek Trojan culture. And then the fourth strategy, which is really the worst possible outcome, is when there is both an abandonment of the heritage culture and little interaction with the receiving culture, or the culture of the new country, and that's marginalization. So you have these four basic acculturative strategies that people have been studying now for approximately 20 years. There does seem in the research to be validation for integration, separation, and assimilation. I think the category of marginalization is often, that's the one where the research is not a little bit more up in the air. So in answer to your question, assimilation would be a subgrouping of these acculturative strategies. So they're the four different ones, and one of them would be assimilation. Is that clear? Yeah.
Oh, this is very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have read Barry, so it was good to have you reinforce this.
Yeah. And the other thing that is an outgrowth of this, these four strategies, is then the idea of acculturative stress and resilience, both. So the idea is that each of these strategies will, create different circumstances psychologically. The person, immigrants are incredibly resilient. That is, like in my book, like the repeated message. These people are just show us the most amazing things about human nature. And so that resilience is really incredible. But there are particular stressors that come up, and so there's this concept of a culture of stress. And that's why in the survey that I did, I asked that kind of question about what have been particular challenges for you as an immigrant. That was trying to tap into that notion of a culture of stress. Because that really is where, especially in the psychological research, people are looking at like things like, what is difficult about fitting in, like what you were asking, and how do people show resilience, but where do they wobble? So,
Thank you so much.
yeah.
Do we have other questions?
Hi, this is Rich Stevens.
Hi.
Hi, thanks so much. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I can't help but think of the hero's journey here,
Mm-hmm.
going through the different stages: immigration, death, rebirth. You mentioned Virgil. I also was thinking of sort of the Elysian fields with the underworld as well. Transformation and atonement sort of come here. So my question is really on atonement. As you know, I mean, it's very easy sometimes to get stuck in sort of like the four quadrants. I think that many people are really sort of stuck in the middle over there as they try to maybe borrow from one or the other, and so on, as they try to form their own personal identity, right, and reach maybe like a stage of individuation. Is there have you seen like where people have had that sort of atonement where they've like forgiven themselves for maybe either abandoning their old culture or basically following the culture of the new realm, like the new place that they're in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. I mean, there's a couple of pieces to what you're saying that are, I think, a bit complicated. If I can take a stab at unpacking them, it's a great,
please go ahead.
A great question. I think the one thing about, so atonement would to me like be something about reparation and a sense of coming to terms with mourning. Yeah, that you made a choice and that choice foreclosed a certain path, and now you're on a different path. And so it's really about like what did that foreclosed path mean? And so that could be just a grieving kind of process. Where this gets very dicey and complicated is when there's been trauma. So in an immigration process, there are three stages. There's the pre-migration stage, there's the migration stage, and there's the resettlement stage. And at any of those stages, trauma can occur. So pre-migration, of course, is in the home country, or for many people, it's often in a camp of some kind of refugee camp where they've been temporarily housed while awaiting, being placed or getting a visa to somewhere else. And so pre-migration is the home country, or some kind of safer place while they're waiting. Migration is the transit. And again, the transit isn't you get on a plane and you just go somewhere. I mean, that's kind of our fantasy. That rarely happens. Now, it may happen for somebody who's incredibly wealthy and has means and has can buy property and therefore get one of these investor visas. But even for them, I mean, sometimes there are hoops that they have to jump through. But what I wanted to go back to about your question about the atonement is the idea of like, so if there's been trauma, I think it is a little bit harder to forgive oneself or to separate from where the trauma might have occurred. One of the things that we know about trauma is it tends to freeze parts of the psyche in time. And this is, this is incredibly painful. And so if you've been in the process of trying to move and you have trauma pre-migration, well, that's going to be one particular kind of circumstance you're dealing with. If you have trauma during transit, which often happens because traffickers are involved or people are robbed or assaulted, they're often criminal gangs. So that's a different kind of circumstance. And then the resettlement phase, the trauma can often be like just the way people are treated. And it can involve things like xenophobia or discrimination, racism, all those things kind of come into play. And so trauma, I think, makes it a little bit harder to kind of come to terms in some way with that path. And that's where we get the idea of intergenerational trauma. That is, a lot of it comes out of research on immigrants. Now, it wasn't thought of initially as research on immigrants. It was thought of as people who had survived the Holocaust and moved to Israel or moved to the United States. But they had moved, and they had moved, bringing with them, horrendous memories and experiences of trauma that they had gone through. And then what people started to notice was that though they might have adapted, the subsequent generation would often be showing, like issues or questions about what went on in my family, questions that weren't being answered. And so this idea of intergenerational, and it's often unconscious, transmission of trauma can make that whole question that you're bringing up about atonement feel a little bit elusive. So I would say, absent trauma, you're probably talking about a mourning process and really use the word individuating. So it would be something about, I made this choice. I decided at that point in time to do X instead of Y. I can no longer do Y. I can't turn back the clock. And so coming to terms with all of that is a very different process than, when I decided X, I was physically assaulted and beaten up, and I have these horrendous, memories of my injuries and what happened to me. And that's a very, very different kind of process then. So I think these things are, somewhat dependent on the presence or absence of trauma. And we know that trauma it appears in different ways. I mean, there's the one-time traumatic event where a person is, has a life-threatening thing happen to them. But then there's a cumulative trauma where these things seem to happen over and over again. And people are even talking about like the idea of complex chronic trauma in situations like Syria, where there's been a war going on. Was a war going on. I think now, thanks to foreign intervention and whatnot, the government has regained mostly control, but like over a period of years. And so when a population is exposed, when we as human beings are exposed to that chronically, that's a very devastating situation psychologically. So I hope that kind of teases out a couple of the pieces that you're asking about.
It did. And also, I just thank you. I read your book about male alienation. So thank you.
Thank you, Rich. The other thing you mentioned that I want to just bring up quick is identity and building an identity. And, again, this would be a whole other talk. So I think I keep saying stuff like that. But the thing about identity is it's been a bit co-opted by what I would think of as identitarian movements. And so it's often now, I think identity is kind of questionable as a psychological term, only for the reason, I mean, it's valuable as a demographic term, no questions asked, but that it sort of is often used to segregate us into categories. And that sort of is the opposite, I think, of what we think of when we think about having an identity that's open and enriching and, looking for new experience and wanting to learn and be in relationship. So in the book, I introduced this idea of perimeters, and perimeters are really like these external markers that somehow label us. So one good example is citizen and non-citizen. So there's a legal and an administrative perimeter there that kind of separates citizens from non-citizens. But then if people take that inside themselves, like as a piece of their identity, they're in a way like, it's a bit like assimilation. They're kind of overriding something about their lived life experience. So there's a little bit of a problem here, I think, with some of these external perimeters or markers when we take them inside and use them in definitional ways or as statements about who we are that might contradict or be at odds with what our lived stories are all about.
Is there another question?
Carol, this is Bob in New York. I'll have a question.
Great, Bob. Hi.
Let me see if I can get my camera on. Yeah. Well, I just wanted to thank you, first of all, Robert, for your talk. And it sounds like I've got other books to read of yours too. I was thinking about my family history way back. My grandmother's family on the mother's side came from Germany and settled in Texas and spoke German and a bit of Czech to talk to the farmhands, and did not speak English. And when my grandmother moved to Houston from a town called Weimar in Texas, she spoke no English. And so fortunately, her mother's family were in Houston and knew some English, and she acculturated quickly. But then, of course, there was the First World War, which meant that you had to hide anything German in your background. I saw a depiction of this in East of Eden, where their German friend has a brick put through the window. So I can imagine that my family went through that, quickly becoming totally Americanized. Mm-hmm. And we, of course, then lost, and the family was traveling back and forth to Germany all the time when they lived in Weimar in English, Weimar in German. And of course, after the First World War, and I guess the Second World War too, we completely lost track of any of our relations there. And the German culture was unexpressed in any way in the family. So I thought you might be interested in that, just a family dealing with migration in the 1860s through, say, even to today. We have no idea who we are. In fact, an aunt of mine traced some of the stuff back to Dusseldorf, but we have no idea who's there that might be related to us. I have more to talk about my own thing too, but I can come back later. But I just thought that would be interesting as an opener. Do I have time to say a little bit more about myself?
Yeah, I guess so.
Well, I think I resonated a lot with the ideas that you were presenting And just a person moving from Texas to New York 40, 50 years ago. I remember my professor at NYU spoke with a thick Brooklyn accent, and I kept wishing I had subtitles. I could not understand maybe every third word. And so there was that adjustment. And then the other thing that happened, I came out as gay once I got to New York, and I had to go through a whole situation with the gay community and the straight community. I was working for a very uptight company, Texaco, at the time, and so I had to hide all that. So coming out at that period was strictly a thing among a few of your friends. My family knew nothing about this. And so there was a hide and seek, a kind of like learning the ropes. You know, if you wear a red tie on Friday, that means you're gay. Or, you know, all this very, very, we called it dropping a bobby pin. You know, if you let out the fact to those who knew what was going on that you were gay. Then, of course, you see, since I had not gone through any of my teenage years dating, I had to go through all of the dating situation as a late 20s person. And with all of the things that Aeneas went through, you know, the disasters. And then in my 40s, once I got into psychoanalysis, Jungian depth psychology, you know, and got feelings hooked up to it, I had to go through another whole journey of dealing, because feelings got involved. It wasn't just raw sex anymore. It was like, oh my God, now what do we do? You know, I've fallen in love with this guy. And so your outline is it applies to way more than just people moving from one country to another.
Right.
As long as you allow that Texas is a state, not another country. So anyway, I'll mute now and just see if you have any comments. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. That was really touching, and I appreciate your remarks. I think what you're saying, though, is so important about like being in transition, right? Like you know, moving, within the U.S. Sometimes it can feel like, you know, maybe not entirely another country, but like there are just different social norms and different ways of talking, different slang, different accents, and different foods, and you know, the people sometimes, you know, seem different in public. I mean, it's just all these things that, I mean, because we're such a big country. And then, of course, you know, your own personal transition. And I think, you know, so that word transition would be my kind of resonance with what you were saying. And that's, again, the Aeneid is always in transition. And I don't know. I mean, I actually think the sudden ending probably, I mean, you could make a case that he did it intentionally, that Virgil did that intentionally, because he couldn't think of the next transition. That it really is just moving and constantly trying to adapt and trying to dig deep to find a way to cope. And so there's all of that really speaks to that kind of hero's journey. And something about like, yeah, how is this going to settle? How is it going to work out? The thing that you mentioned about hiding also is so important. I mean, and I think one of the early chapters in my book, I talk about, you know, a family situation in which the kid grew up not knowing that he was undocumented, and that his mother was essentially in hiding, and as a result, like there were all these strange things that kept happening to him and within the family that had to do with hiding, that didn't have that name. And so, so hiding, I think, is really a powerful idea for like how do we deal with the next stage, the next step? What is it that's going to come out? And certainly the way the stories get told often are full of omissions, full of lies, and full of gaps. And so trying to make sense out of that, especially when you are in transition, can be very, very difficult. I mean, it's difficult enough when your story is reasonably coherent and put together. And when I was in Germany in 2017, I did some work for a refugee organization that was working with youth. So these were teenagers from primarily Syria, although there were a number from Afghanistan as well. And one of the things I learned in my work there is the staff were telling me that part of the problem is that these youth had been so traumatized that they couldn't tell a story about what had happened to them. Well, when you apply for asylum, you have to have a story. If you can't put a story together, that it doesn't have to be, literature. It doesn't have to be like, something incredibly well articulated or organized, but it has to be reasonably understandable. And so for a lot of these youth, their asylum applications were up in the air because they weren't able to, even describe what their original circumstances had been. Some of them didn't want to talk about how they had gotten to Germany because often that had involved trafficking and horrible circumstances. And some of them had also lost people along the way. One boy that I write about essentially walked from Turkey to Hungary. And so you think about the hero's journey, that's a long ways to walk. So yeah, being able to tell a story that other people can relate to is so essential.
If there are no more questions, I would turn the program back over to Jay because he has an award he would like to present and a couple of other announcements before we close. But I don't want to eliminate the opportunity for somebody with a burning question to ask it. Now is the time if you absolutely must speak. Otherwise, I will be turning the program back over to Jay Sherry.
Hello, everybody. My name is Varia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, thank you so much to Robert for this lecture. I also would like to share a little bit about my personal experience. And what you've done is just framed some of these ideas in such a way that I can understand it and make sense out of it. So I appreciate that. I am a first-generation immigrant. My parents moved to the United States from Russia when I was 5 years old. And so I have that layer of experience. And it really starts to make sense when you talk about the cumulative trauma and the complex chronic trauma of all the acculturative strategies. And then just recently as an adult, I've had the experience of moving from Texas to Minnesota. So there's another level of things. And I've just been having kind of a continuous series of events that have been happening to me over the last several months that I would categorize as a complex chronic trauma. So there's a lot of things to ponder on here, and I thank you for your presentation and kind of the information that you've left me with. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you, Vari. I really appreciate that. I mean, there's a case in my book about and it is intergenerational trauma, about a family that they moved before the Soviet Union broke up. So they left in the 80s and moved to Israel first, I think. Although I may have to go look in the book because they moved a lot, and so there's something about like what they brought with them from the Soviet Union and then they left Israel and ended up in the U.S. and then they left the U.S. and went somewhere else. But there was something with all these moves that had to do with a trauma that went back to World War II. And it was really, it took quite a bit of work. I worked with the daughter who had a very interesting phobia. She had a bird phobia. So if she saw a bird, when I saw her, she was started seeing her at about age 9. I saw her from ages 9 to 12. But if she saw a bird, it could become a safety issue. She would run into traffic. She would, she just went out of her mind with fear. And so it was very interesting because in the course of working with them, I started to think about what is it about birds? And then I realized, oh, they fly. It's true that they nest, right? But if you're a kid, your idea of, unless you're really interested in ornithology, your idea about most birds is they don't stick around for long. They're like on the windowsill and then they fly away. And so I started to think with her and with her parents about like, what all these moves, like, let's try and understand what happened when you were here, and then what made you decide to move there, and what do you remember about that first place, and what do you remember about the second place? And gradually it kind of got better. I mean, the bird phobia actually went away, but it was really just so interesting, like you think, and there was a particular relocation where the bird phobia had started. So after they had moved to the US, they moved to a city where there was a lot of pigeons, and she was on a playground, and according to the parents, like hundreds, and I've never seen this myself, but I believe it could happen. Hundreds of pigeons landed on this playground, and she just like panicked, and so she had a real experience that kind of looked like it might have triggered it, but it also was happening right after they had moved again. So they had relocated yet again within the US, moved to this new city where there were lots of pigeons. And so you could start to see there's something about the family flying around that was terrifying this girl. And so I appreciate what you were saying, because leaving a place at age 5 is that like you still have memories of that place, you still have sense impressions, you still have language impressions, and so there's a lot that we all carry from those early ages that lives on. I also wanted to, somebody had asked for my email, and so I'm happy to give it. It's RF TYMINSKI. So RF as in Frank, TYMINSKI at outlook.com. So.
Thank you for that, Robert. I'm going to ask Jay. Jay, are you with us?
Here I am.
Great. I'm going to bring you back in. And then, of course, once you have finished sharing some information about next week's program and giving out our wonderful award, anyone who needs to say anything more can then unmute and do so.
Thank you, Carol. And thank you, Robert. Gosh, so much to process. And I guess what came to my mind as I anticipated your talk was a Bob Dylan song, I Pity the Poor Immigrant. And that was a very formative song in Dylan's songbook for me, because as soon as I first heard the song, it reminded me of the grandfather from Poland I never met. He died the year before I was born. His photograph was over my grandmother's bed. And when we would visit, it was so present, a man I did not ever meet. But the nature of the photo was also very, very impactful to me. It must have been taken on a Sunday after church, and the man is sitting in a chair, totally exhausted. Hangdog, leaning over. Is probably the only time in the week he got to sit down, except for when he went home for dinner and then fell asleep. And, I always imagined the grandfather I did not know, which was also true of my other grandfather. So in a way, this closing for me is in honor of two immigrant grandfathers. The other one, he was from Poland. The other grandfather, my mother's father, was from Slovakia, and she only had a couple of stories about him. And one she told me that I was able to translate culturally to me is very significant. I was always interested in family history and heritage. I asked for stories about the man, and one she remembered from when she was a little girl, probably back in the 1920s. She said, well, her father went into a store at wintertime and he asked for a pair of hand shoes, and they laughed at him. Then, knowing German, I told her what the man did was to take the German word for gloves, Handschuhe, and he actually was a Slovak who could handle some German. You can see the bouncing ball. So he was not a dumb immigrant. He was somebody who was a survivor, who knew how to go from language to language as best he could, and that restored an image of her father when I shared that her dad was not some dumb immigrant, but rather a man who negotiated thousands of miles, economic, challenges, family, and all the rest of that. So I just wanted to share that personally and want to thank you so much, Robert, for highlighting and informing us about such a critical planetary process that we're still catching up on. Intellectually, emotionally, academically, and obviously in your great research. Thank you so much. And in honor of your research, I want to display the certificate that will be in the mail to you shortly, but I want all the people looking to applaud you and, of course, honor you with our certificate from the Kristine Mann Library. So thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And in conclusion, I want to thank all the participants for their patience and their, stick-to-itiveness, and want to invite all of you to stay informed about all the exciting things that are going on at and through the Kristine Mann Library. Our website is www.younglibrary.org. Stay posted on all the many exciting things that are and will be coming to you in the weeks to come. Next week, Carly Larson Salome will be presenting on an equally significant contemporary issue. She'll be presenting her research on the political, social other in America's psyche. So please consider attending that one as well. Again, Robert, thank you to all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And I wish you all a good day or a good evening or a good night, depending on where you might be on this wonderful globe of ours. And thank you so much all for presenting and attending. So with that, I will leave you.